All right. A very good afternoon to everybody here, and I'd like to welcome everybody to Who Feeds Bangalore. Who Feeds Bangalore is an exploration into different forces that shape how the city of Bangalore eats. It's a participatory research project fueled by strong doses of curiosity and collective community thinking and doing to get a clearer idea of the people who feed Bangalore. At Phytopia, as part of the Science Gallery Bangalore, we'll dive into Bangalore, explore the relationship that the city has with its plants through a 2-day workshop that includes talks, conversations, and a little bit of cooking and also creating. Thanks again for everybody for joining us today. This session is in collaboration with Bengaluru Sustainability Forum, an inter-institutional collaborative initiative that aims to address issues relating to the long-term sustainability of urban and peri-urban landscapes. Before we get into the talk, a couple of housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphone and video turned off and ask your questions in the chat section. The mediator of the session, which is me, will ask your questions to the speaker at the end of the talk. And this session is also being recorded and is being live streamed to YouTube. And there's also a feedback form that's at the bottom that you can find through which you can tell, it's a poll through which you can tell feedback about the session that's going on. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Spurti Ravi grew up in Bangalore, India, with a keen interest in food, which drove her to become a food scientist. And after stints in multiple food companies like Campbell's and PepsiCo, she's currently the Chief of Research and Development at Goodmylk, a plant-based dairy alternative startup based out of Bangalore. And without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Spurti to tell us a little bit about the plant-based movement in Bangalore and more. Over to her. Over to you, Spurti.
Thanks, Anusha. Well, hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. I'm a big fan of what Anusha and Elizabeth do with edible issues. So they're always looking into ways in which food brings us together, which is absolutely fantastic. And I'm really excited for this project that they're on, along with the Bangalore Sustainability Forum, in collaboration with the Science Gallery on Who Feeds Bangalore, right? I don't really think as consumers, we think about it at that level. So to bring people together from different aspects of the industry, to really have this dialogue and conversation is pretty fantastic. So for those of you who are not familiar, I'm a food scientist by training and by education, and now in terms of my profession. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with what food science is, but basically what it is applying your fundamental sciences, right? That's your chemistry, your biology, your physics, and engineering to food systems specifically. So it's a really fascinating way for someone like me who loved food growing up, and I, was a so-called foodie, and I really enjoyed the cultural aspects of it, the culinary aspects of it, and really marrying that with the technical and the scientific aspects, which is what my undergraduate degree was, which was in biotechnology engineering. So it's a really interesting field, and thankfully over the last decade or so that I've been a part of it, I haven't gotten bored of food, which was one of my biggest fears. So for anyone who's interested in food but wants to take a more technical deep dive into it, I highly encourage you to really find out what food science, or even what some people may call food technology, is. So with that, I'll really get started on my journey and how I got to this point. So I have been vegan for about 3 years now, but it isn't as simple as just turning vegan overnight for me. It has been a journey both in terms of my personal life as well as my professional life. So I'll take you through a little bit of that, and then we can get into some specifics and really see and basically hear my thoughts on why I think Bangalore is just such a fantastic place when it comes to really being a platform for eating plant-based or even being vegan. So I studied food science in the US. Perfect, thanks, Anusha. So I studied food science in the US, and I continue to work there. As Anusha mentioned, I did an internship at PepsiCo and then at Campbell's. And towards the latter end of my work is really when we as a company at Campbell's were really trying to understand what the plant-based movement was really about. So we had a pretty large team that was focused on doing a lot of consumer ethnographic research. What that means is actually going into the homes of consumers, seeing what they claim to eat, what they actually eat, and what they're trying to do differently, especially when it comes to their kids. And one commonality that we saw across the board, irrespective of what their socioeconomic background was, is that everyone was trying to eat more plants and lesser animals. So that was a pretty interesting insight, right? Because a lot of people in the US, especially, they live on food stamps with very little money. So eating plant-based basically means spending a lot more for produce versus it would be much cheaper for you to get processed foods in terms of McDonald's or nuggets that are available in the that are available in the stores, etc. So what we noticed is that they're willing to spend that extra money, especially on their kids. According to the previous conversation, you all must have heard how important it is to eat produce that is pesticide free and that is clean. So parents always prioritize their kids and they really, make sure that they give them organic produce, but they're not doing that themselves. So we really took a close look at the consumers. We heard some heartfelt, heartwarming stories about a lot of people who had reversed their diseases because of going plant-based. And that included diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, as well as cancer, which was very surprising to me because at that point of time, I knew very, very little about what the plant-based movement and the plant-based diet was really about. So all of this really sort of pushed me to research more, understand more. And there are a lot of medical pioneers who study this field. There's Dr. T. Colin Campbell, who's done the infamous China study, which is a very beautiful, detailed study. You can either go buy his books or listen to his talks on that. There is Dr. Dean Ornish in the US. There's Dr. Matthew Greger. There is Neil Bernard. So a lot of scientific published journal research that showed how going plant-based can actually reverse a lot of your health conditions, especially when they're lifestyle related, right? And what are lifestyle diseases? As I mentioned, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and a couple more that go along with it. So this really propelled me also then to start looking at the food aspects. Now, if someone were to eat plant-based, what is it that they have to give up? And what is it that they can include? Because as a foodie, I really wasn't ready to give up on things that I really enjoyed, right? When I planned my travel, the itinerary was surrounded or based on all the restaurants that I wanted to visit, all the cafes that I wanted to eat at. So did going plant-based mean that I can't do all of that? That was a very daunting question that I had to answer for myself. And thankfully, through this work project, I work with some fantastic chefs who also were vegan. And one of the chefs that I encountered, Chef George Tatakis, if you're in Detroit or San Diego, hello from Bangalore, but he had been vegan, this was about 6 years ago, for almost 25 to 30 years. And I was just surprised, right? This was way back when there were no alternatives available. There was nothing available. You had to do everything yourself at home. And taking a bold step in really choosing to live this way was something that I hadn't come across. So I would say he was sort of that first seed that inspired me to look in this direction. And then there's a really popular restaurant called Veg in Philadelphia, where the focus is really on the ingredients. So they look at produce, they look at vegetables, and they don't look at ways of masking it, which is what happens a lot of times. Think of like comfort food and dishes, you cover it with cheese, you cover it with oil. Nobody wants to taste vegetables. But Chef Richard Landau at Veg, he really enhanced the flavor of those produce items. And it was the first time that I tasted a fondue, which was made of rutabaga, which was a vegetable I hadn't even heard of at that point of time. And it was fantastic. I think I would choose it over the cheese fondue even before I turned vegan. So this really showed me how expansive eating plant-based can be and how it wasn't really restrictive or limited, right? So I think it really sort of took me on, it started off that journey and that path that has helped me reach this point today. And along the way, what I did is I transitioned out of dairy. So I started consuming a lot more nut milks and grain milks. And, I felt that my digestion was definitely much better. I was feeling lighter, healthier. So I reaped some personal benefits from it. But I still didn't make the transition yet. I would still eat that occasional piece of cheese. I would still have desserts from time to time. And for personal reasons, my husband and I, we decided to move back to India. And Bangalore is my hometown. So I fought really hard to come back here as it's a city I dearly love. And when we moved back in 2016, I took 6 months off of work. And during that time, I really, sat back and I had some time to really prep and see how I could potentially, eat way more plants than I used to before and wean off the animal foods even more. And the surprising thing that I realized, so I did grow up in a South Indian household, and most of the food we actually ate at home was, I would say, and it's a vegetarian household. So most of the food that we eat was like, I would say 90 to 95% vegan. The only non-vegan things that were on the table were ghee that we would add on top. There was curd that was also on the table. So it struck me for the first time that this is really not as difficult as I imagined it to be. There are very small tweaks that I needed to make where I could still sit down with my family. I still didn't need my mom or my grandmom to cook anything different for me. But at the same time, I could, potentially be vegan. And I will get into the difference between plant-based and vegan in a little bit. So they come from two very different philosophies. But basically, the point that I want to make here is, again, it's not as restrictive as you think it is. So finally, I made the leap. I decided to go vegan. One thing that I was also afraid of was being labeled vegan. So unfortunately, when it comes to this movement, there have been some negative connotations that have been associated with it. And people feel it's harsh, it's aggressive, it's cult-like. And these were some of the concerns that I also had, because I've always been someone who's very open and fluid, and that's how I really like to live my life. So did I really want to put myself in this box? Did I want to be identified as those preachers who always try to brainwash you into going vegan, right? But I put all of that aside and I decided to take this leap, and I was like, I'm going to make it my own. I really don't have to follow anyone else's philosophies around this. If I feel that this is right for reasons X, Y, and Z, then I can make it my own and embrace it in a way that I am comfortable and slowly build on that. So that was my approach to it. And in the summer of 2017, I went fully vegan. And this is a point where I'd like to pause for a bit and really explain the differences of being plant-based and vegan, because you've also heard me talk about those terms interchangeably, and they're not, right? So plant-based is focused on what you eat mostly, and it comes from a place of improving your health. So a lot of these doctors, why did they really prescribe the plant-based diet? Because there's research to show that it can improve your health. So the focus is on your health. And typically when people say plant-based, it also means more whole foods and less processed foods. But when you talk about veganism, it's not just about what you eat, right? It's an entire lifestyle. So the basic philosophy is, how can you live more kindly? How can you live more gently? How can you live more compassionately? And that is truly what the essence of being vegan is. So that means, respecting other species, which is animals. So keeping animals and animal byproducts off your plate, which is food. It's off your skincare that you use, the makeup that you use, the candles that you burn. There are so many places, the leather that you wear or that's on your car seat. There are so many places where animal products are used. And unfortunately, as much as like we'd like to believe otherwise, it comes from a place of cruelty. So vegans really want to avoid all of that. But there are two other entry points, right? Animal cruelty is one aspect of veganism, but a lot of people, especially over, I would say, the last 5 to 6 years, are turning vegan because they're concerned about the environment. And today, I'm sure you'll hear a lot of that in multiple conversations. We're all worried about, the climate crisis, the global warming that's taking place. And we all, in our own small way, want to really contribute towards it. And going vegan, as determined by the Lancet report, which did a very detailed study and came up with what they call the planetary health diet. And what is that diet? They haven't really stuck to being vegan or not, but the lesser animal-based products you eat and the more plant-based products you eat, the more impactful your food choices can be when it comes to saving the environment and slowing down this global warming that we're seeing. So environment is a huge reason why a number of people are drinking different kinds of alternatives, milks today. And then the third reason is, of course, there is health. So unfortunately, we are humans. We are selfish in our own way. My entry point into this entire lifestyle was actually health. That's actually what got me started on it. And when you realize you can feel better, when you realize that you can simultaneously protect the environment or do your part in it, and when you realize that the animals are being respected, there's no cruelty involved, I think you can sleep with a much better conscience. So today I'm very proud to call myself a vegan, which is something that I really hesitated with for a very long time. And that's also because I've understood where a lot of vegans who seemed harsh and aggressive came from. Because once you actually expose yourself to the cruelty involved, once you actually look at these videos, you see these documentaries, there are a number of them out there, it's very hard to unknow it. You can't really sleep, you can't really eat, no, ignoring those stories behind what's actually gone to get those animals to your plate. So with that, I think, hopefully, you'll have a distinction between what veganism is and what plant-based is. And today, veganism and vegan movement is actually really opening up. It's not about being 100% vegan, because it is a journey. It took me at least, I would say, after 3 years, most of my choices are in line with being vegan, but it took me a lot of time. I had to make choices with the house cleaning products that I bought. I had to make choices with the skincare products that I use. So it's really not possible for you to accomplish it overnight. So to be gentle with it, to be patient with it, and to really take your time to make those changes is something that the entire movement is very supportive of. So it's really not one versus the other anymore. And when it comes to Bangalore and being sort of, I would say, like the heartbeat of the vegan movement in India, and at the same time, a city that really celebrates plant-based foods, I have multiple thoughts and opinions on it, right? I think first off, I've only seen Bangalore transform from 2016 because there were a good 8 years in the middle that I wasn't in the city. But even then, when I came in, there was a very loyal, passionate group of activists who really tried to bring awareness to people. Their goal is not conversion always, right? It's to build awareness and tell you what is happening behind the scenes. So then you are empowered to make the decision that you think is right for you. So Bangalore has a very, very strong community that I've gotten to know slowly over the years. And even when you think about the first vegan restaurant in India, Carrots, that was started 7 years ago. A huge shout out to Shushmita from Carrots, who took a very, very bold step, because 7 years ago, and anyone who's familiar with the restaurant industry, you know that restaurant business is a tough business, right? I think a lot of you are aware about that. On top of that, you're adding another element in taking a stand of keeping it vegan. So to be able to take a step like that really shows how much passion you have for the cause, and how how brave you are in order to deal with the consequences of that. And I was so happy when I touched base with Shushmita recently to hear that they celebrated their 7th-year anniversary a little before the lockdown hit. So Bangalore really encouraged this. And I think part of it is because the community is open-minded. They're willing to hear different sides of the story. Nobody is really hell-bent. We have a very young population, which also helps, because that's when you really have the flexibility to change your lifestyle choices and to potentially take a different direction. And now, along with going vegan personally, I also had to change a lot to do with my work, because I'm a food scientist. I deal with food all the time. So in my previous past work experiences, I worked on chicken-based product, I worked on beef-based products, and even though I didn't eat it, I worked on these products because those were the products that we were selling to consumers. But today, as someone who's taken such a strong personal stand, am I able to do that? Absolutely no. I just could not get myself to develop dairy-based products for any client of mine. So when I started my consultancy back in 2016, I did take a call on making sure that everything that we did was plant-based. And it was primarily me. So I worked with a lot of startups, and thankfully, either by default, they weren't specifically plant-based products, but they happened to be plant-based because they had no animal-based products and byproducts in them. So I ensured that all the projects I was taking were along those lines. Was that an easy decision? Absolutely not. I think, especially since I moved to a different country, I was establishing myself. the more work that you get as a consultant, the better it is for you, the more exposure you get, the more you can build your network. But there was a part of me that just couldn't make that trade-off. I couldn't really give up on my personal philosophies for work. And in a way, I'm very glad that I stuck with it. And ultimately, I found home in now what is called Goodmylk. So it is a company that's focused on plant-based dairy. The co-founders are Abhay and Radhika. And Abhay actually started this as an activist. He was a young kid, fiery, a lot of passion, probably a little angry too, which he's not anymore. But it came from a very good place. And he really wanted to see how he can make this transition. So if you're going out as an activist and you're talking to people and asking them to potentially try something different, those options need to be available. But none of those options were available back in 2016. So what Abhay decided to do is actually get his mom to help him make some products and actually go around and supply these products across the city. And that's how Goodmylk was born. And I initially worked for them as a consultant, and now I'm with them full time because there are so many exciting things that we're doing. And for those of you who are not very familiar, I will get a little technical here, and maybe in the questions I can address anything that I haven't covered. But plant-based dairy is very different from dairy that comes from mammals, right? There are differences in the kinds of proteins that are present. There are differences in how the product is stabilized. So it's not as easy as taking something, milking the nuts or the seeds, and then making a product out of it. There's a lot of science that goes into it, and it's very tricky when you want to keep your product super clean and you want to make sure it's as nutritious as possible, but at the same time functional. So at Goodmylk, our mission is not just to have products that feel like dairy, but that also function like dairy, where you can make a strong, let's say our milk, you should be able to make a strong filter coffee with it. You should be able to boil it in chai. Or our curd, you should be able to use it in a raita or a kadhi, so we've really thought about the Indian context and how Indians use dairy, especially from a culinary perspective. We've also tried to, really make sure that our products are as affordable as possible. Because if our mission is to help people transition from eating more animal-based foods to more plant-based foods, the way we can do that is to make sure that the price barrier is as little as possible. And this is not easy, right? Like think about the price of almonds or cashew nuts, for example, and think about the price of milk. It's vastly different. So we are trying to get really creative, and we are trying to really do our best to keep those numbers as affordable as possible for our consumers, because that's the best way in which we can achieve that mission. And I think, it's great to also have partners. And this is where Blue Tokai, which is a coffee chain, has come in and really done a fantastic job in partnering with us and offering our plant-based milks at the same cost of dairy milk, right? So today, if you go into a Blue Tokai and if you want to try a plant-based milk, price cannot be a barrier as to why you don't try that. So going back to the products, as I mentioned, there are a lot of differences. What we're essentially trying to do, if you think about dairy, dairy is typically obtained from mammals, right? Whether cows or buffaloes or certain other animals. So what we're trying to do is do what the animal body or even the human body, because we lactate and we produce milk, does externally by using equipment and creating the same product. And that sounds very easy, but from a technical aspect, as I mentioned, it's not. So we are working on it. I think our products, when you compare them to the dairy counterparts, you will notice some differences, right? I'm not going to tell you that you can have our milk and it's going to taste exactly like whole milk. We are working on it. We're continuously iterating to bring it closer, but there will be differences. So I'm going to take two of our products at Goodmylk and really explain to you what some of the sensory differences are and how I am tackling it from an R&D perspective. And that'll give you a better idea about some of the challenges that exist as well. So let's take, for example, our curd. We make our curd based on peanuts. And I wouldn't say it's really proprietary idea, especially to Goodmylk, because a lot of the Indian households and a lot of people who have been vegan for a long time have been making peanut-based curd in their home kitchens for a very long time. But what we had to do is take that and figure out a process which works so we can make it on a much larger scale and make it available to people across the country, hopefully. We are focused on South India currently, but we are expanding to other regions as well. So when you look at our curd, it looks white, it looks beautiful, looks similar to dairy. It scoops, it's firm, and the texture is very similar. But what is one thing that we're really trying to work on is the flavor, because peanuts inherently have a different flavor compared to what dairy has. And there are different ways in which I can solve this. Some of it is to mask those flavors and to use a lot of additives, etc., which we want to avoid because we want to keep the product really clean for the consumer. But at the same time, we want to try and get closer. So we're looking at some very interesting technologies that in the future, hopefully, will even help us improve the taste. So the barrier is never going to be the taste of peanuts for anyone who doesn't like it. But otherwise, if you ask me, it makes a fantastic curry. It makes a fantastic raita. We make a lot of hunker dips out of it at home. So it really does work in many ways, like the dairy counterpart. When it comes to milk, I think, we're pretty good on the texture, the mouthfeel. It's thick, it's creamy. We're pretty good on the aroma. It has a little bit of that Swedish aroma that you expect from dairy, where, again, when it comes to flavor, that's one of the biggest barriers. You will taste a little bit of nuttiness. You will taste a little bit of that cereal that we use, which is oats. But like I mentioned, there are ways in which we can eliminate that very quickly today. But to do that, I may have to add some synthetic ingredients. I may have to do things which maybe nutritionally I don't feel very good about. So there are a lot of trade-offs that need to be made at this point as we develop the plant-based dairy sector, especially for the Indian context, who uses dairy very differently from how the West uses it. And that is something that's very exciting for us at Goodmylk, because we're so driven by this mission of helping people eat more plants and eat less animals, and basically having these options conveniently available to them. So, so their transition, their journey, their choices become much easier. And a big part of why I think Goodmylk has succeeded so far is the strength of the community, right? So when I think about Bangalore, and I mentioned before as well, it may be slightly smaller than maybe the community that exists in Bombay, for example, which is also very strong. But there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of fire, there's a lot of loyalty, and the consumers have really held our hands along the way. There have been times when the product hasn't been so great, or we had a manufacturing issue, and they've been patient with us. So that's something that we at Goodmylk don't take for granted. And that's something that I also love about Bangalore, is people are willing to work with us to really, develop these things which are not that easy, that take time, but also, ensures that we do it the right way with the right philosophy in mind. And the other thing as a consumer that I would like to comment when I think about Bangalore, especially when it comes to plant-based foods, is when I came in 2016, there weren't a lot of places actually where you can go and you could ask for plant-based or vegan and get those options, right? Like I mentioned, carrots was one of them, but that was probably it in a couple smaller restaurants. But then slowly over 2017, 18, I started to see a lot more food service restaurants open up in terms of small cafes that started serving plant-based vegan options, which is definitely exciting for people like me, because we want to go out and we want to eat and we want to enjoy food too, right? And also when I started seeing more plant-based milks pop up on the shelves, it was exciting because to make almond milk for one person who's vegan in the family wasn't easy. I was wasting a lot of almonds. I was throwing away a lot of milk that was getting spoiled. So to know that these options were easily available to me and I could purchase them was also exciting. And I think today when I look back and I realize where we are at in 2020, it's just been such a fantastic transition. I went on to Zomato a couple days ago, and there are tags saying vegan and plant-based. So it has never been easier to order food, to go out and get food that is vegan and plant-based. And to me, the exciting part is that these are not just coming from vegan or plant-based restaurants, right? They're coming from everyday restaurants. And that is the kind of inclusivity that I would like to see. And that's the kind of inclusivity that I think really helps break barriers. Because when we go out with friends, I can't force all my friends to eat vegan, but I can go out to a place that has both options. They can try some of the vegan dishes as well, enjoy it, and then it becomes a lot more inclusive. And I think I'm very excited to see more of that happen in time, especially in Bangalore, and to really see this community grow and for people to be and stay and continue to grow that sort of experimental attitude that they have in the city, and continue to hold our hands and hands of many other companies that will potentially come up in this space. And that's that's something that I want Bangalore to remember, is just don't forget how strong you are as a community. And I think that'll really help us position this city as one of the smart cities, not just in terms of, you know, the IT innovations that are going on here, but also in terms of the food innovations and the fact that we could potentially show a different way of eating without a lot of compromise. And I think with that, I will probably hand it over to Anusha and we can take up some questions.
Yeah, sure. So thanks so much, Spurti. Before we get on to the questions, I want to ask you a question as a consumer. When you think of any food choices, especially a food choice like veganism, which also involves you to think about the region that you are in to a greater extent, how can you be sort of mindful of that? Like, how can you be mindful of alternatives, also keeping in mind the region that we're at?
I think that's a fantastic question, Anusha. And I think being in India really helped me make that jump for one reason, is because we have so much of that locally available that you can substitute for, right? If we think about the dals, the millets, you know, the fact that jackfruit is available very easily and it does a fantastic job helping you make meat-like dishes. Now, like a lot of mushrooms are being produced by smaller players and smaller farms in and around the city that helps you get those meat-like textures. So I think overall, when we think about especially the environment and how our food choices can affect them, you're absolutely right. Making sure that it's as local as possible is also important, because if we're just going to consume fancy imported foods that happen to be vegan, it's really not going to help any of us today and not going to help tackle any of these issues at hand. But it takes some creativity. You know, people across, I remember when I was in the US and people were making lentil bolognese and it was like this big thing. And I was like, okay, what is it all about, right? It was pretty much like a gravy with our dal in it. So I was just like, wait, it's just positioned and marketed in a very, very different way. So I think we in India have the ability and have the access to so many different kinds of grains, pulses, legumes that help fill nutritional requirements, help fill the sensory requirements, especially when you're sort of moving in that plant-based direction, that it positions us to really do much better. And even I'll take, for example, Just Egg, right, which is a company that has been trying to really create the perfect plant-based egg out of which you can make omelets and scrambles and things like that. What is the key ingredient that they use? It's actually moong dal, and they call mung bean protein. And most of their initial R&D work, if I'm not mistaken, actually comes from India. They did some pretty interesting work where they took their actually Just Egg and they gave it to a lot of these carts where they typically sell bread omelets. And they had people, Indians, locally walking around the street, taste that. And they were like, this is fantastic. And I think this has been happening in terms of street vendors in Delhi for a long time now, but we just never knew about it, right? So it's also really tapping into these hidden gems. And the other thing that I really like to keep in mind is try to be seasonal. So when it comes to being local, it only makes sense that you're also eating seasonally. So when you eat seasonally, the other thing that is a concern that is addressed by a lot of people converting to veganism is the cost associated with it. Because there's a big misconception that going vegan or plant-based is actually going to bump up your grocery bills a lot. Honestly, I think I probably halved my grocery bills, and I use everything organic. And I make sure that I'm very particular about the produce and the ingredients that I use. And still my bills are very, very low. Because when you eat seasonal, it's coming from places that are close to you. So the transportation costs are much lesser. You know, the costs associated with storage are much lesser. You get fresher produce that's more nutritious. So it just checks off a lot of boxes. And I think from a more technical research perspective, there's a lot of work being done with certain organizations in Hyderabad and GFI, etc., where they are really tapping into the ancient Indian grains, especially when it comes to millets, and seeing how we could potentially position that as being an excellent source of protein. Like, why should we only get protein from pea, right? That's not the only plant-based source where you get protein. But today, when you think about it, vegan or plant-based source, everyone basically pushes you towards a pea protein, and that is what is available. But I think in the next 5 to 6 years, we'll see a lot of exciting developments in this space. And I think India is really positioned to have an impact just based on what we have available to us.
Awesome. So let me start taking questions from the audience. Shivani wants to know, does Bangalore have a bigger culture of plant-based eating when compared to other cities in India?
I would say, I think it started off, this is again, in my opinion, I've been in Bangalore technically for the last 4 years. So I've sort of missed out on that early part of the movement. But I do think Bangalore started off sort of being, one of those cities where you could be vegan and you had a lot of options. But I think Bombay and Delhi has actually caught on very, very quickly. I personally love going to Bombay and enjoying the food there, especially as a vegan. It's just they have so many options, fantastic cafes, a lot of desserts, which is something that I love, which is hard to get your hands on often as a vegan. So I think Bombay has really sort of come up very quickly. They've built a very strong base. And the interesting thing there, it's a strong food-driven city. So I think it's positioned itself pretty well there. Delhi has also caught up tremendously. But I think the difference though is that Bangalore, even Hyderabad, I would say, and Chennai, we're all smaller maybe in numbers, but we're a lot more passionate and more committed and sort of more loyal about it. I think the community is a lot more connected in these places. And I've noticed that in the South Indian cities, especially, that aren't big in numbers, but I think they're really there in terms of community strength.
So are the vegan products that are developed accessible to a larger society than just the vegan community? I think, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, that is the goal, right? I'm going to say that is the goal. Our goal is, my goal in terms of focusing on developing plant-based products, even personally, is not really for just the vegans to have it. Like today, my mom has transitioned completely and she has her daily tea and coffee with our product, which is Goodmylk. But she is not 100% vegan by any means, right? So in fact, I like to be positioned to cater to the non-vegans because you're the ones who are going to be true critics for us. The vegans will always compromise. They'll be like, oh, having these options is good enough, right? Because we didn't even have this before. But a non-vegan will be like, no, this is very, very different from what I normally have. So they really keep us in check as well from an R&D perspective. And I think they set the bar high, which is exactly where I want it to be. Like, we cannot stop the development at the phase that it is right now. We have to get better. The products will have to appeal to people, who are flexitarians, as they call them, because they eat more plants, they just eat less animals. Another point there is a lot of people who transition to oat milk or almond milk over the years are actually not vegan. Like most people are actually flexitarians and they just happen to like the taste of these products better. They like the taste of their coffee or cereal with these products better. So definitely not. We want to be as inclusive as possible. It's just not about, catering to a small community. The goal is more plants, less animals.
Awesome. So Shruti has a question, which is, what are your thoughts on the almonds and avocados are not vegan debate? Could a vegan consuming almonds make this person a vegan hypocrite? Especially if the person is an activist.
So again, I think there are a lot of debates floating around. There are a lot of points of view that people are going to take. There are people who are going to tell you that plants have feelings as well. So, you can twist and turn this in the way that you want it to be, right? But I think inherently as a consumer, you just want to get closer to your food. So to me, the way this journey started off is not just about, meat versus no meat or dairy versus no dairies. How do I get closer to my food? So when you get closer to your food is when it exposes all the downfalls of certain systems that are in place. So when you talk about almonds, I would say when compared to, so about a glass of milk requires about 120 liters of water, right? Think about it. 120 liters of water is required to produce 1 glass of dairy milk. Now, almond milk, there's a lot of debate saying it's not sustainable because almond milk requires about 80 liters of water for every glass of almond milk that you drink. Yes, but it's much lesser than dairy one to begin with. So we're already moving in the right direction, right? And then when you look at other alternatives, like rice comes next at 55 liters, I think, for a glass of milk. And then when you look at soy or oats, it is 10 to 20 liters per glass. So think about that number, right? Where 120 is and where these numbers are. So yes, like eating almonds is definitely part of a healthy and wholesome plant-based diet, but we don't want to do anything in excess. A part of the issues that we're having, even if you think about it from a meat and dairy perspective, is back a couple generations ago, nobody was eating this much dairy. Nobody was eating this much meat. So excess of anything is bad for us. And I'm going to say the same thing about all the plant-based alternatives as well. As long as you're conscious, as long as you're having it in moderation, definitely not a problem. And I really don't know what the problem with avocados is, actually. I know vegans and non-vegans alike love avocados in different ways. So I'll probably go look that up after this conversation because I'm curious about it.
Okay, so I think Arpit wants to know if there are any specific low oxalate plant-based milks that he could consider. He mentions that when he tried switching out from dairy, he had kidney stone issues.
Got it. So I think that is something I'll have to research a little bit more as well, especially because if someone is prone to sort of building up oxalates and having stones, etc., you really want to get into the numbers. And there are a lot of plant-based products also that contribute towards it, right? So typically for kidney patients, for example, you try and avoid tomatoes because tomatoes can sort of contribute towards that buildup. So I think it's beyond dairy. I would say you have to look at all the ingredients that you consume. And really, my recommendation would be, what I would do is go to a nutritionist, someone who can really break down the components of the food for you and really create a plan saying that, this is how you could potentially be plant-based and have low levels of oxalates in your diet. That would be the right way to do it. I wouldn't only focus on the dairy part, actually, or the milk part. Like, look at everything else you're consuming, because he's right. A lot of plant-based foods, greens, tomatoes, etc., they all can have levels of oxalates that could, for some people, be an issue.
Okay. So Kumar wants to know, with the increase of plant-based diets in India and globally, do you think plant-based and vegan product-based companies keep in mind the ripple effect of such demands? For example, monoculture of, say, cashews or avocados or almonds, which tend to be the basis for most of these products.
Definitely. It's a really tough one. I'm going to say that, even at Goodmylk, we're a company that has a lot of activists in the company. We have environmental activists, we have vegan activists. So we're all trying to do the perfect job and make the perfect decision. But it's very, very hard because there are trade-offs that you have to make, right? It really depends on what the state of the industry is today and how much you can solve for that problem. Because if let's say, either I would take Goodmylk as an example, if we as a company want to solve all the problems that exist, we can never launch anything. So our strategy in these situations is make the best choices that you can today, get the products out there, but never lose sight of how it can get better. How can it be more sustainable? How can we avoid monoculture? Do we have to stick to cashews and oats? Are there millets that I can work with? Are there other grains that I can work with? Is there a combination of materials that I can work with? So yes, Kumud, that's something that we're all keeping in mind, but that's also not a problem that we can solve for today. It's just it's going to be a slow process of trying to make the right decision every time, and hopefully try and diversify, right? And one of the health benefits of a plant-based diet actually comes from its diversity. So if someone's on a plant-based diet and they're only going to eat almonds and cashews and greens and potatoes, it's not going to help them in any way. The more you eat, I think there are recommendations for at least 30 to 40 varieties per week is what you want to consume. And when I did the math, without even trying to, thanks to all the lovely fruits and vegetables that we have in India and grains, I can easily go up to 60 to 75 without even trying to incorporate it. So I hear you, Kumud. It's something that we keep in mind. It's not a problem that is solved for right now because we're still not that big. We haven't reached that point where, plant-based industries are causing monoculture. But again, if you see the movement, right, like almond milk was very, very big at one point of time. And it does produce a very delicious, creamy product that makes it easy for everyone to like. But people have identified issues with it. And that's why now you see oat milk becoming a lot more popular because it is more sustainable in that way. So I think there's going to be a lot of changes. It's not going to stop with that. And hopefully, it is always top of mind for every company. We try to keep ourselves honest, and thankfully having activists who do activism outside the country, it helps us really stay true to that path.
Right. So Elizabeth wants to know, why can't we just eat and cook the variety of plants around us? And how do you see product development versus just educating people on edible plant biodiversity?
I love your idea, Elizabeth. Like, that's what I want people to do, right? Like, ideally, if you ask me, because if we look at energy efficiency, as they call it, right? So I actually pulled these numbers up yesterday, if it was relevant in this conversation. That is, if we take the amount of feed that we, give the animals, and we were to understand the output that is coming from it in terms of either the dairy or the meat, the energy efficiency for beef is at 1.9%. So out of all the feed that you're feeding the cow, only 1.9% comes out as meat for you. Or the energy efficiency for whole milk is at 24%. So out of everything that you're feeding the cow, you get 24% of the energy out in terms of milk. The energy efficiency for poultry, which is slightly better than beef, is at 13%, right? So I would love to see the phenomena of what you're referring to, Elizabeth, which is, forget about always trying to make something with all these ingredients, right? Like, go back and have the ingredients itself. So it could be like, why do you want to make moong dal based eggs? Why not just have the moong dal? Why do you want to make pea protein based meat patties? Why not just have peas? It's very simple to say that, but consumers are consumers, right? People want variety. People are accustomed to certain tastes. And that is what the industry is trying to do, is help sort of cater to those demands and cater to those requirements that exist and provide them with options. But at the same time, I think, especially in a country like India, and if I look at my own diet, I am barely eating any of these so-called processed products for the most part, right? It's going to be dal, roti, sabzi. It's going to be different kinds of pulses, different kinds of rice. And yeah, I think it's easier said than done for consumers. But if we can highlight this and talk about this more and have sort of these, debates and discussions, then we'll be positioned in a place where maybe people choose 10% of those, processed milks and processed meat alternatives, etc. But the 90% of their diet will actually be that ingredient itself. That would be a really nice ratio, or even an 80-20, but it's going to take some work. And the other thing I would say there, Elizabeth, is it really depends on the comfort of the person, right? So when someone is new to a plant-based lifestyle, they immediately try and replace everything that they're having in the animal-based lifestyle with a plant-based counterpart. Now, that's how it starts off, but slowly, they also realize there are different ways in which they can make food. There are different recipes that they can use. And slowly their dependence on these products become lesser and lesser, and they end up using more whole foods. So I think it's a combination of time, people, and awareness and education, as you mentioned.
Great. I think we have just a couple more minutes to go. I'll just quickly skim through the other questions and see if there's something that we've not tackled before. Okay, so one thing about nutrients that I'm missing. So Ambili has a question, which is, as a food scientist, what are the new chemicals getting into our food when we try to replace things like regular milk with nut milk or eggs, etc.? And what do you say about the nutrients that one misses when they go vegan, like omega, if I'm not wrong?
I am really glad she brought up that question, because the nutrient parity is something that I didn't address when I was, talking about this. Is you're absolutely right. I think when you move from dairy to any plant-based alternative, for that matter, there will be a different approach that you need to take to meet your nutritional needs, right? Because if I take even Goodmylk, for example, we don't have as much protein, which is something that we're trying to work on, as much as your dairy milk has. So now if someone's going to consume our milk and assume that they're going to get the same percentage of protein, that's not going to happen. But what I would encourage people to do is really, the food industry is very, very transparent, right? The ingredients that go into your food and the nutrition is always on every pack that you purchase. Flip the pack, look at the back, really familiarize yourself with what that nutrition looks like. Now, what that means is you need to diversify your diet in a way that you incorporate those elements that you're missing. So you're absolutely right. A lot of times omegas are a concern. They're surprisingly not a concern just for vegans. They're also a big concern for non-vegans just because of the diets that we have these days. So what you'll have to do is, what are some plant-based sources? You could use flax seeds, you could use walnuts, right? They have ALAs, which are a different kind of omega-3. So, you'll have to come up with creative ways in which you include all these nutrients. That's something that I've spent a lot of time over the last 3 years, because nutrition is something that I am particular about, besides also being plant-based and vegan. So you have to get very creative with it. You have to educate yourself. And I think take this as an opportunity to really educate yourself about food. And I think that's when you'll really, to Elizabeth's point, you'll really open up your eyes on how nutritious plants can be. Calcium is something that I suffered with throughout my teenage years. And every time the doctor told me, drink more milk, drink more milk, drink more milk. And there was only so much milk that I could drink. And I always had to take supplements. And after I turned vegan, I've been very particular about my blood tests year over year. The first thing that I noticed is my calcium levels were actually in the normal range for the first time. And I was like, wait, this is very confusing. I thought it would have gotten worse and I'll have to bump up my supplements. What I noticed is that I was eating a lot of sesame seeds. I was eating a lot of greens, like all these things which are very plant-based foods, which are very rich in calcium, that are never positioned to us as a source of calcium. So you'll be surprised with how you can get almost all the nutrients from a plant-based diet. It requires some planning and education. The other thing that you will also hear about, especially when it comes to comparing these two diets per se, is B12. Right? So B12 is something that's just not a function of a vegan diet. It's actually a function of how sterile our entire food supply chain has become, because B12 is produced by microorganisms. So for something like that, I would definitely recommend a supplement. It's hard for you to get it. There are certain sources, like let's say chlorella or spirulina, that can have small levels of B12 that you can actively absorb, but you will have to depend on a supplement for that. So yeah, just be creative with it. You can find a way in order to go around it. And sometimes you will have to rely on a supplement. That's not a bad thing either. The second part of the question, I think, was around the chemicals that are getting into the foods that were potentially not in dairy foods, right? So one of the things that if I really look into the dairy industry and the problems that we're having today, and I believe even the FSSAI did a study recently, a couple of years ago, which showed that 60 to 70% of the dairy-based products we consume are actually adulterated in India. So there's a lot of adulteration happening. People are always trying to sort of give you the shorter end of the stick. There's a lot of hormones, antibiotics being used. So positioning dairy as a very healthful category is also not right. Yeah, there are some elements which are good. Does it have a good source of protein? Yes. Does it have calcium? Yes. But, it also comes with a lot of baggage, right? And animal-based products have cholesterol, which none of the plant-based products have. So the way you look at it is, the way you look at it in terms of additives is there are some products that are going to be cleaner than the other. Like, let's say we use a gum, which is called guar gum, in our Goodmylk products in order to give us the viscosity that we require and the mouthfeel that we require. Now, this is a natural product that's actually coming from certain seeds. So it's not really synthetic or chemical. There are some companies that may use certain additives like CMC, etc., which are food thickeners that are also synthetic, that are proven to be safe. But again, they are synthetic, which we have less faith in. So you'll have to do your research on that. And I think, you will be able to find solutions that are clean. And if you can make them at home, it's going to be the cleanest, right? You can make your almond milk at home, your cashew milk at home, whatever you want. It's going to be super clean and you don't have to worry about it. Certain products like ours will have some additives, but they're required for functionality and they're still natural.
Thank you so much, Spurti. Thank you so much for your time and answering all the questions very articulately. For the next session, we have Geetanjali Rajamani, the co-founder and COO at Pharmazin. And don't forget to check out all the exhibition at the Science Gallery website for more such interesting talks and workshop. And yeah, thank you so much, guys. I think we'll be seeing you in a couple of minutes for the next talk.